Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we recreate famous figures from the past and talk about their history. Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of the most famous women in Scottish history. Today we'll guide you through her fascinating life, and then at the end we'll bring you face to face with Mary by revealing our reconstructions of her death mask. So let's go ahead and get started. Mary Stuart was born on December 8, 1542, at Linlithgow Palace, about 15 miles outside of Edinburgh, Scotland. Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, was a noblewoman from one of the most powerful families in France, and her father, James V, was the King of Scotland. For James, royalty ran in the family. His uncle was none other than King Henry VIII of England. With all of these royal family connections, Mary was one of the most noble women in Europe, with legitimate claims to multiple thrones. On the day Mary was born, her father was away, battling English forces only a few days before at Solway Moss. As fate would have it, he would never meet his new daughter. 6 days after her birth, King James V of Scotland died, and with no other heirs, the infant Mary became Queen of the Scots. Of course, what this meant in actuality was that Scotland would be ruled by regents until Mary was 18. But the regencies brought problems of their own. First, it was given to the Protestant Earl of Arran, but he was met with heavy backlash due to the fact that he was very pro-English. Soon after taking power, Arran had begun marriage negotiations with Henry VIII that would have not only promised Queen Mary to Henry's heir, Edward, but also sent the young queen to England to be raised as a Protestant under King Henry's supervision. The marriage would also effectively end a Franco-Scottish alliance that had been rekindled when James V wed Mary of Guise. It didn't take a genius to realize the offer would benefit the English greatly and leave Scotland on their own. The Scottish Parliament refused the offer, and Henry, of course, had a tantrum about it. He would order an immediate and brutal military campaign against Scotland with the intention of bullying them into the marriage. The Scots would later call this war the Rough Wooing. This aggression would completely backfire against Henry, instead uniting the Scottish population against England. In those early years of Mary's life, she was constantly under threat of capture and had to be moved from place to place, never fully safe. Finally, in 1548, King Henry II of France proposed to unite France and Scotland once again by marrying the young queen to his 3-year-old son, the Dauphin Francis. The proposal was accepted, and 5-year-old Mary would be sent away to France, leaving her mother and the only home she had ever known. But it wasn't until Mary arrived in France that her young life really began. Her delicate looks were commonly remarked upon in the French court. They were entranced by her smooth complexion, strangely light brown eyes, and red gold hair. She was growing tall and athletic. She loved to ride, hawk, play tennis, and dance. She was not only beautiful, but smart and charming as well. It was in the metropolitan French court that she learned to speak 5 new languages, as well as study poetry and debate. Nicknamed the most perfect one, she quickly became a favorite with everyone at court, including her husband Francis. The King of France remarked, "From the very first time they met, my son and she got on as well together as if they had known each other for a long time." In April of 1558, Mary and Francis were officially married at Notre Dame. The marriage gave their future children the thrones of both France and Scotland, and a claim to England through Mary's great-grandfather Henry VII. But in a twist of fate, the French King Henry II would die in a jousting accident just a year later, leaving 15-year-old Francis the throne. On July 10, 1559, Francis and Mary became the King and Queen of France and Scotland. France now had full control of Scotland, and in an astonishing move, almost asserting claim on the English throne, they emblazoned their own coat of arms with English symbols. Now, if you're wondering why Mary would even think about doing this, we first have to explain the chaos that had been happening in England since King Henry VIII's death in 1547. Over the last 15 years, the crown in England had gone through massive upheaval. It had passed through Henry VIII, his son Edward, Lady Jane Grey, Mary I, and now finally rested with Queen Elizabeth I, who was the last of King Henry's Tudor line and the daughter of the vilified Anne Boleyn. With French forces in Scotland and Mary's open use of the English coat of arms, there began to be discussions that Mary should in fact be the Queen of England. She was Catholic and had just as much, if not a better claim to the throne than Elizabeth. If Queen Elizabeth wanted to fight for her claim, she would have to do it by force. With Protestant Scottish lords on her side, Elizabeth sent an English fleet and 6,000 soldiers to the port of Leith in Scotland, and demanded that not only the French forces leave, but that Mary and Francis stop their use of the English coat of arms. This move would prove to be a masterstroke by Elizabeth. France had no money to fund a large-scale war, and even if they did, a potential loss to England could result in Mary losing her claim to Scotland. France's representatives would instead negotiate a deal with England. They would leave Scotland immediately, and Mary would promise to stop using the English coat of arms. But weeks later, when Mary and Francis were asked to ratify the treaty, they refused to sign it. Almost always on the same page, it seemed that the pair were set to become a powerful and supportive team in the European landscape together. Their children would one day rule France, Scotland, and maybe even England. But just as the dream of her life was beginning to form, Francis began to feel sick. Suddenly, on December 5th, 1560, King Francis II died. Mary, effectively overnight, was no longer useful. She had lived in France since she was 5 years old and had dreamed of living there for the rest of her life. To make things worse, her mother, Mary of Guise, had also died, compounding her grief. For the next 9 months, she could do nothing but grieve for her husband, for the children that they could have had, and for the life in a country she had grown to love. But she realized she still had something: Scotland. In August of 1561, Mary left the sunny countryside of France, and after 13 years away, returned home to Scotland. When she arrived, she was greeted by a divided country, torn between Catholic and Protestant lords, with her own brother leading the Protestant faction. As a devout Catholic herself, many believed that Mary would arrive and immediately enforce her religion, but instead she allowed them to tentatively keep their power. Many historians believe that her ignoring the religious problems in Scotland show that she had her sights set on a bigger goal: the English crown. By 1561, Elizabeth I had reigned for 3 years. At the age of 28, she had yet to marry, and England was becoming anxious about the line of succession. Mary reached out to her cousin in peace, requesting to be named heir should Elizabeth die. After all, she had an excellent claim, and it seemed to be a peaceful compromise compared to taking it by force. Although Queen Elizabeth secretly knew that there was no one with a better claim than Mary, she refused her. But it's hard to blame Elizabeth for who she had become. She had lived a life of mistrust and lies from nearly everyone she knew. Her mother had been killed by her psychotic father, and her own sister had imprisoned her for a year. No matter how sweetly Mary asked to be named heir, Elizabeth felt that she could not trust her. Some historians think that there may also have been an element of jealousy. Elizabeth probably resented her tall, beautiful, and charming cousin, who, unlike her, had always had the confidence to be queen. In fact, the only person Elizabeth felt she could trust was her best friend and probable lover, Robert Dudley. In a shocking move, Elizabeth offered up Robert Dudley for the Queen of Scots to marry. She felt that Mary could be controlled via Dudley, and all of her problems would be solved. If Mary accepted, Elizabeth promised that she would name her heir apparent. Unfortunately, Dudley, perhaps wounded by Elizabeth trying to give him away, was the party that refused the deal, and Mary began to look elsewhere for a husband. She would find one just a few years later in a man named Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Some say the marriage was entirely political. Lord Darnley also had a claim to the crown of England, but others say that Mary was in love with him, and they would wed on July 28, 1565. But it wasn't long before Lord Darnley began to overstep himself with Mary, and she began to see him for who he really was. Not simply happy being consort, Darnley demanded that his wife give him the right to the Scottish throne if he should outlive her. Mary was extremely hurt by this proposition, and of course she refused him, which outraged Darnley. The incident put a strain on their relationship, and it soon began to fully unravel. Darnley began to drink and spend most of his nights drinking with other noblemen. But even within their strained marriage, there was some hope. Mary was pregnant with her first child. Unhappy with her personal life, Mary became good friends with her private secretary, David Rizzio. An excellent singer and a good musician, she adored his company, and Mary and her ladies-in-waiting began to dine with him and entertain him often. Unfortunately, this didn't escape the notice of the Scottish elite, and ugly rumors began to spread that Mary may in fact be pregnant with Rizzio's child instead of Darnley's. On March 9, 1566, Mary was once again having dinner with Rizzio, when suddenly a group of Scottish noblemen, led by her own husband, burst into the room and accused them of adultery. Rizzio and Mary would vehemently deny the accusation, but the men would not take no for an answer. In front of the 6-month pregnant Mary, the men attacked and murdered Rizzio in cold blood. Mortified, and fearing not only for herself but her unborn child as well, Mary began to plead with Darnley of her innocence. Whatever she said, she convinced Darnley to get her out of there as quickly as possible. The two would escape from Holyrood House where the murder had occurred, and would hide away for days before Mary finally felt it was safe more than a week later. But Mary would never be able to get the image of David Rizzio out of her mind. Her weak, jealous fool of a husband had viciously murdered her friend. She would never forgive him, and she would never love him again. In the summer of 1556, Mary would give birth to their son, James. Right after he was baptized, Mary held a meeting to discuss what to do about the problem of Darnley. Divorce was the obvious option, but everyone knew that would be difficult to get, especially because she was Catholic. But before anything could be officially agreed on, Lord Darnley became ill with a fever and would remain sick for the next few months. Now, because of their estranged marriage, Darnley had moved out of the palace to a mansion nearby called Kirk O'Field. During his sickness, Mary would sometimes visit him there, and after a few weeks she began to visit him daily. Rumors began to spread that maybe the thought of losing him had rekindled Mary's love for her husband. Then, on the night of February 9th, 1567, an explosion suddenly rang out, just inside the city wall. When witnesses arrived, they saw the house that Darnley had been staying in was on fire and completely blown apart, with no walls or ceilings still standing after the blast. Not long after, Darnley and his servant were found dead in the garden. But when they examined the bodies, there were curiously no burns and no damage, not even a mark from the massive explosion that had just destroyed the building. And it became obvious to everyone there. Lord Darnley had been murdered. According to the Queen's servant, Nicholas Hubert, when he entered the Queen's bedchamber the next morning, he saw that the Queen was speaking privately to a man, and recognized him as James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Rumors began to swirl, and it seemed clear to some that either the two were having an affair, or that Mary had asked Bothwell to murder her husband. James Hepburn was accused of assassinating Lord Darnley, and was put on trial soon after. But the case against Bothwell would be difficult to prove, with no eyewitnesses and nearly all evidence burnt to a crisp in the fire. There was nothing that pointed directly to Bothwell, and ultimately he was acquitted of Darnley's assassination. But this story still had one final twist. On April 23rd, Mary was returning from visiting her son James when she was kidnapped by none other than the Earl of Bothwell. Historians argue about whether Mary was in on this kidnapping or not. But it's hard to imagine she wasn't, because less than a month after her capture, Mary and Bothwell were married at Holyrood House, the same place that Darnley had murdered Rizzio a year before. While she was said to have thought the marriage would be popular, both Protestants and Catholics began to turn on her, shocked that she would marry the man that many people still believe got away with the murder of her husband. Even Queen Elizabeth would send her a letter confronting her about the marriage. How could a worse choice be made for your honor than to marry such a subject, who besides other and notorious lacks, public fame has charged with the murder of your late husband? Although she defended the marriage, it was obvious now that Mary had made a huge mistake, and the damage to her reputation had been permanently done. 26 Scottish lords would unite and turn on Mary, including her own half-brother James Stuart. The rebelling lords would raise an army, and although Mary would try to raise an army herself, she knew that the battle was lost. On June 15, 1567, Mary would surrender to the Scottish lords and was taken prisoner. To add insult to injury, her husband Bothwell was allowed to flee the country, leaving Mary behind, completely alone. When they arrived in Edinburgh, she was met with crowds shouting at their queen, calling her a murderer and an adulterer. Less than 10 days later, she was forced to abdicate the throne that she had held since she was 6 days old. How had it come to this? She was only 25 years old. Just a few years ago, she had been happily married as the Queen Consort of France, adored by every subject. Now she was watching her own life unravel before her eyes. She would remain imprisoned, not able to see her son, and not knowing her fate for the next 9 months. But finally, the following spring, men who were still loyal to her helped her escape. Even with this freedom, she had nowhere to go. Nowhere but England, to the woman she had once seen as a rival, pleading for help. Queen Elizabeth had always been paranoid of conspiracy, which famously led her to never marry due to fear that a man would take that power from her. Surely now she would not let her cousin, a woman, be taken from her own throne. It was Mary's only chance. Unfortunately for Mary, she didn't receive the welcome she thought she would. Although Elizabeth's first instinct was to help Mary, she was soon talked out of it by her council. Many Catholics in England still saw Mary as the rightful heir to the throne. And to make things worse, Pope Pius V had recently spoken out against Elizabeth, which led to major Catholic riots in the north. Her Protestant position had to remain strong. Mary, like she always had been, was just too much of a threat to Elizabeth. She was allowed to remain in England, but not as a guest, as a prisoner. Elizabeth did give her the courtesy of not putting her in a cage, instead allowing Mary to live in a castle with her staff and her ladies who dressed and fed her. But she would always be watched and remain under the strict supervision of men loyal to Elizabeth. Soon, the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years. But Mary still held out hope that one day they would let her go. Unfortunately for Mary, plots to overthrow Queen Elizabeth just kept cropping up, each one intending to place Mary on the throne in her place. These rebellions were supported not just by the people, but also by the Spanish government and the Pope. There was no peaceful way for Elizabeth to release Mary. By 1584, Mary had been imprisoned for 17 years. Her hope for freedom had long left her, but she still had one last card to play. With Queen Elizabeth growing older each year and still no heir to the English throne, she pleaded to Elizabeth one last time for a favor. Make her son James, who she had not seen since he was a baby, heir to the throne, and give her back her freedom. In return, Mary promised to give up anything and everything. Her claim to the English crown, her Catholic religion. She would denounce the Pope, even betray her beloved country of France. It was the desperate plea of a broken woman. All she wanted to do was live the rest of her life in peace. But like every time before, Queen Elizabeth would refuse. As a final insult to Mary, Queen Elizabeth would later agree to name James as her heir. James had agreed to fight his mother's captivity as part of the deal, but now there was nothing about Mary's freedom in the agreement. Betrayed by her only son, Mary was outraged. If Mary was going to live the rest of her life as Elizabeth's prisoner because of Elizabeth's paranoia, Mary would give her something to be paranoid about. Mary began to secretly write letters to her supporters, written in elaborate ciphers that would make the letters seem like gibberish to anyone but the intended reader. By 1586, she began to exchange letters with a man named Anthony Babington, who said that he had 6 assassins ready to kill Queen Elizabeth. Mary would reply, and she and Babington would exchange letters, furthering the conversation. Little did Mary know, the letters she had been sending were being intercepted by English agents, and after some time, her cipher was decoded. In Mary's final letter to Anthony, she finished the letter with these words: "Let the great plot commence. Signed, Mary." The implications were clear. Mary had signed off on a plot against Elizabeth's life. In August 1586, Mary was arrested for treason and was put on trial that October. At the trial, Mary defended herself bravely, denying the charges, but also stating that Queen Elizabeth was not her queen, and that English laws could not apply to her. In the end, she was declared guilty, with the punishment of death. But Elizabeth was struggling to bring herself to sign the death warrant. Mary was a queen after all, just like her. She even asked Mary's custodian if he could somehow shorten her life, but he refused. It would take Elizabeth 3 months, but finally, she signed the execution warrant. 7 days later, on February 8, 1587, Mary arrived at the Great Hall, where her sentence would be carried out. She knelt down on a cushion and prepared for the end. When the executioner knelt down and asked for her forgiveness, Mary replied, "I forgive you with all of my heart. For now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." Mary, Queen of Scots, had been imprisoned in England for 19 years. She was finally free. It was said that soon after her execution, before her casket would have been sealed at burial, that 4 death masks were cast from Mary's face. One is called the Linlithgow mask, kept safe by the Duke of Hamilton at his estate for over 250 years. This mask shows the Queen looking young and serene, with hardly any trace of the harsh imprisonment showing on her face. Another mask, called the Jedburgh mask, was also made, and at some point in its history, makeup and a wig were added. And the other 2 masks that were reported have since been lost to history. Now, there's some doubt around their authenticity, since records for each are spotty, with some saying they look too young to be the 44-year-old queen, or that these masks look like 2 different women. But when we compare the death masks to each other, and then to her portraits, the proportions of her face are consistent across each. I think they are all the same person. To me, the death masks show a more realistic appearance, more in line with the descriptions of her charisma and beauty than we see in the painted versions. I've used the Linlithgow version for my recreations, so let's see Mary brought to life from the Linlithgow death mask now. When looking at the death masks, do you think they're Mary? We also have a modern version of Mary created in an older video linked here and in the description, so check that out. And we'll see you all for the next video.